Recently, I was looking through the contents of an old wallet that had been with me during the last weeks of the Pacific War. It reminded me of a trip from Perth to Manila that coincided with the end of the war celebrations. I tried to remember how that trip had started and what mood I had been in at the time. Rummaging through Air Transport Authority receipts and Lend-Lease certificates, I came across a blue sheet folded in half that read William Capell, the greatest piano talent since Horowitz. This leaf brought back memories of my last days in Australia. The news of the end of the war came on Friday when I was at a farewell party at an American club. We were quietly dancing, drinking and playing fruit machines. The unexpected news made us very happy, and the festivities went on all night. We travelled by car through the park past the tall cypress trees and along the embankment of the River Soup. Then we went to the sparkling city centre where the people were partying, singing and dancing. We stopped by friends who greeted us cheerfully and treated us to vintage wine. A new day was approaching, a peaceful day. The sky, where the stars were beginning to fade, was also peaceful. The war was over. When we arrived at the floating base in the morning, it turned out that the naval headquarters had not been moved in the slightest by the news of peace. The submarines continued to go to sea, and my request to cancel my reservation for a seat on the plane leaving for Sydney the next morning was refused. This turn of events only added to the hangover we were experiencing. After gulping down a shot of rum and drinking milk, we looked out the windows at the unchanged landscape and grimly began to pack our bags. That evening the crew of one of the submarines were having a dance in town. Usually they were noisy and merry. But I didn't care for fun. I didn't want to leave Perth on the eve of the victory celebrations. With a heavy feeling I wandered to the officers' club, took a room, lay down on the bed without undressing and stared at the ceiling. I was not going to the dance. My head was buzzing and I had no desires. In the morning there would be a plane waiting for me on the runway which would separate me from my friends to take me to the stuffy, dirty jungle. The situation seemed hopeless. At that moment, the phone rang. It was a pleasant female voice with an Australian accent. The charming wife of a friend of mine was asking if I wanted to go to a piano concert at Perth University with them and have dinner at their house after the concert. It was as if she knew I was in need of a holiday. I replied that I gladly accepted their offer and jumped out of bed feeling a rush of energy. These Australians were very charming, kind and cheerful people. Some angel had told them from heaven that I needed nothing more that evening than to sink into a chair in the concert hall, close my eyes and give myself to the music. William Capell was playing the piano that evening. He was a short young man of 22. His fingers fluttered over the keys, producing pure, melodious sounds. It seemed to me that if he wanted to, he could easily lift the piano on his fingertips and make it spin. The music subsided and we walked out of the hall into the night. My friends drove ahead in their car and I drove behind in mine. The houses and trees flew past, the music still played in my ears, and I was enchanted by Australia. I wished that the enchantment would not dissipate before the plane took me up into the sky. In the same romantic frame of mind, I left my friend's house. The sky was clear. From an open window came the sounds of a piano. The lady of the house was as gifted as she was beautiful. Her husband shook my hand and wished me a happy journey. Thanking him for the evening, I started the car and drove into town. Early in the morning I arrived at the aerodrome, where the aeroplane was already warming up its engines. The noise was terrible. The airflow from the propellers bent the dry grass to the ground and raised dust that hid the first rays of dawn. I hurried back to the flotilla. Rumour had it that our boats would be the first to enter Hong Kong harbour if the Japanese did indeed lay down their arms. Time went terribly slowly. We spent the night in the Australian Air Force canteen where the lights burned brightly and wine flowed. The next 2 nights we spent in Melbourne and Sydney. All my attempts to expedite my flight to Manila came to nothing. I encountered delays and delays everywhere. I went to Navy departments, talked to my superiors, paid fines, signed for the 100th time, but all for nothing. The post-war fever had already started. Nobody cared about me and my trip. On the faces of commanders of all ranks, there was an expression of indifference even when I was boiling with righteous anger. Eventually, Sunday morning, I was standing on the hot pavement of Mascot Aerodrome in Sydney. All my papers had been left in the officers' mess where I had spent the night, but I had no time to go back for them. The aeroplane was due to take off soon. A ladder was attached to the hatch on the fuselage and passengers began to climb up it. I followed them. Due to the increasing accidents of us Navy aircraft, British officers and sailors were ordered to fly Australian Air Force aircraft. As a result, travelling time was greatly increased. I had no doubt that I would be stranded somewhere between Sydney and Manila, such as Manus Island, for a long time, and I was prepared for such a turn of events. The plane took off at 9 o'clock and began to slowly gain altitude. Through the porthole, I looked at the unfolding panorama of the city and harbour below. Suddenly, the streets of the city went dark. Thousands of people came out of their houses. Some climbed onto rooftops and threw brightly coloured streamers into the air. Smoke billowed from the chimneys of the ships in the harbour, and flags flew from the masts. I thought I could hear the horns of those ships. The door of the pilot's cabin opened. The aircraft commander came out of it and said with a smile, "The war is over." The cockpit door closed. The aircraft tilted heavily and set a course for Brisbane, where we were to land for refuelling. That evening we landed on an airstrip near the town of Townsville on the northeastern tip of Australia. Everyone we met on the ground had a tired look. They must have had a hard day. I found the naval canteen. In the stuffy, poorly lit room, a few sailors were reading newspapers. "The war is over," I reminded them. "So what?" one of them said. I stepped out into the fresh air and looked up at the high, dark sky. Then it turned out that the sailors had been dragging barrels of oil to the top all day, to be set on fire during the celebration. The small, quiet town was preparing to celebrate the end of the war. I strolled slowly through the streets and happened to meet an old friend who had just arrived in the harbour on a motorboat. We shook hands and joined the walking crowd, which grew larger as darkness fell. Somewhere up above, a fire flared up. It was oil on a high cliff. A moment more, and down came a waterfall of fire. It was an unforgettable sight. The crowd responded with loud cheers and whistles. The city came alive. Lights were lit everywhere, doors opened, dance bands played. The streets were filled with jubilant men and women. Some of them wore swimming costumes. Carnival cars moved slowly by. Sailors watched them, putting their lips to their beer bottles. It was an amazing, fantastic night. The small town on the Pacific Ocean became a centre of attraction for the people of the surrounding villages, an island of fun in an ocean of darkness. The party went on all night and ended only when the sky over the ocean was illuminated by the rays of the sun. There was almost no one on the runway where we were taken by car. A few passengers with haggard faces stood near our plane and looked down at their feet. Oil continued to burn on the high rock. The aircraft commander approached and the engines roared to life. Soon we were already taking off towards the dawn. At the bottom, my mate, who had stayed on the ground, was waving to me. The last time we saw each other was a month ago in Ceylon. We'll remember that night in Townsville for a long time. The shores of Australia disappeared beneath the tailplane. From behind a cloud bank, the sun was beaming down. The aeroplane climbed higher and higher until it reached an altitude of 20,000 feet. There was nothing to see, so I put my head down and fell asleep. Fuel was refueled at the airstrip near the town of Holland. New Guinea was striking in its dense greenery. There were tall trees growing beside the runway. As soon as we got off the ground, the heat was brutal. I tried to hide from it in the tall bushes, but it didn't help. The heat was everywhere. In a tin-roofed hut, I was given a cup of tea and some bread. Here, the unshaven, half-naked, unshaven gas station attendants, tired of the heat and their monotonous work, sat gloomily at the table. They looked at us as if we were from another planet. As we took off, I waved to the poor souls who were destined to stay in this scorcher, but they didn't wave back. Ani's Island. From the height of the flight, it was very beautiful and resembled a surrealistic picture. The water in the lagoons, bordered by white sandy beaches, depending on the depth of the water, changed its colour from bright green to black. Our plane flew over the naval base and began to approach for landing. After another minute of flying over the water itself, it rolled along the runway of Manus's neighbouring island and came to a stop. Manus is an island of lost souls. I went to the transit camp I had managed to visit earlier and found that it had become a barracks for non-Americans. This was a bad omen. A few men were sleeping after a party in 2 tiers of bunks. Outside, nothing had changed. The same beach, the film screen between the palm trees, the same, though somewhat faded, red and blue umbrellas over the tables near the clubhouse. At the same time, a certain dejection was evident in the inhabitants of the camp, and they walked with their heads down. I went into the clubhouse and met a distraught reporter who was drinking whiskey and Coca-Cola. He told me that he had come to Sydney to then attend the liberation of a small island held by the Japanese, and here the war had ended. Now he had to get to Japan, where the American troops were landing, but he was stuck on this island, and now all he could do was drink whiskey under a blue umbrella and watch the planes fly away. Hey, it's easy to get to these islands, he told me, but it's impossible to get off. I'll be stuck here until I'm old. It turned out that Australian Air Force planes were scheduled to make several flights from Manus to Manila, but almost all of them were delayed, because the pilots were celebrating the end of the war too vigorously. Sea sparkled in the light of the young moon. The place was extremely picturesque, my palm trees black as pitch, white beach. But we didn't want to stay here for more than 24 hours. Something had to be done. The next morning the reporter and I passed the British liaison officer's cabin and went to the Americans' location. We gave them a detailed account of the case and asked for their cooperation. The Yanks replied politely but firmly, sorry, no room. After breakfast, I stopped a jeep heading for the British naval base, hoping to board a ship heading north. The jeep rolled down a tarmac road paved by the Americans through the jungle. The road was far from villages, and we saw only a few locals sitting on the grass, staring blankly at the passing lorries. Their shacks were hidden behind the trees. The signboards warned that entry to the village was strictly forbidden. The sun burned mercilessly. Dust rose from under the jeep's wheels as it travelled along the embankment connecting the islands. At Manus the road went uphill and then down to the sea, where many ships were anchored. The Americans had set aside a portion of the island for the British. The base was in a picturesque place on the crest of a mountain overlooking the harbour. On a high pole flew the British naval flag. Everyone we came across at this base looked happy and content. The driver stopped the jeep, and we disembarked on the hard, trampled ground. White arrows on board showed us how to get to one department or another. From the seaside came the incessant noise of harbour work. In the harbour, motorboats were scurrying back and forth like water beetles. On the other side of the hills, a village of small wooden huts was scattered among the palm trees. Apparently, this serene environment had a bad influence on the base management. They could not understand why I wanted to leave Manus. They wanted to know where my papers were and who authorized me to travel. They asked who I was and what the purpose of my trip was. When I was sure I would get nothing out of them, I went back to the jeep, lit a cigarette and waited for the driver. It was midday. The sun was overhead and the palm trees cast almost no shade. When I returned to the runway, I found the reporter lying in the shade by the water. He had a sour expression on his face. An hour later, we were sitting in a club drinking bitters. An elderly American introduced himself to us and told us that he was the commander of a plane that would be making a non-stop flight to Samai Island the next morning. We explained our situation to him, and he offered without hesitation, "If you want, fly with me. Be at the airstrip at 3:30. That's how easy it all worked out. I tore the Lend-Lease forms into little pieces and threw them away. The wind picked them up and carried them away. The sun was setting into the sea. A black barman in a white tunic switched on the lights and began to rub a chrome shaker. Manus seemed like a marvellous island again, but there was the same hopelessness in the eyes of the lost souls sitting next to us. At the mention of the Philippines, the first thing that comes to mind is Manila. Yes, we were in Manila. We stepped off the plane and dragged our luggage across the hot tarmac. A yellow haze hung over the city. In the airfield building, we walked from one desk to another and politely asked the lethargic, apathetic Americans where to find a car to take us to the city centre. We were told that there were no cars, and that since we had managed to hitchhike across the ocean, we would somehow get to the city centre on our own. After much persuasion, we were given the telephone number of the headquarters of the Forward Echelon of the Australian Expeditionary Force. We called there and heard the old questions. Who are we? Do we have papers? Who do we report to? And so on. In response to my inarticulate explanations, I was told that they could not help, and, after apologizing, hung up. Yes, we know Manila. We got to the centre in the overcrowded back of a truck. On the way we looked around at the city ruins and inhaled the pungent petrol fumes. With great difficulty we found the office of the American Navy and began to beg the officers to send us to the base, assuring them that otherwise we could die of hunger or thirst. They refused to help us and advised us to drink whiskey, which could be bought in any shop. I preferred chlorinated water. In the evening we reached Corridor in a small boat, where we spent the night. In the morning, in the pouring rain, we boarded a landing boat that took us to a small village on the edge of the jungle. The ground beneath our feet had turned into a mess of mud. It rained non-stop. There was no wind. The locals were hiding in their shacks. In the bay stood our floating base. Ignoring the rain, we walked along the sandy beach. Our hair was wet, water was running down our faces, but we were in no hurry. The cabins of the floating base are warm and dry. We will have dinner sitting at polished tables and drink whiskey with friends. We had travelled a long way and were very happy to be home. First in the South China Sea. The surface of the water is as flat as glass and the sun is scorching mercilessly. In the afternoon we came into shallow water and the shores of China suddenly appeared in a bluish haze. On deck the sailors looked towards the shore. Our strange squadron stretched across the light green water for several miles. Ahead of them are 5 Australian minesweepers in formation. They are followed by the Maidstone floating base, accompanied by 2 groups of 4 submarines, their camouflaged hulls gleaming in the sunlight. Behind comes the Canadian cruiser Prince Robert. As we move towards the coast, black clouds roll in from the north and rain begins to fall. The coast disappears into the fog. Not a good time for navigators. The outlines of minesweepers are blurred. Submarines are almost invisible. We anchor 2 miles off Joss House Bay and 10 miles south of the entrance to Hong Kong Harbour. There are no signs of life around. A few small junks are floating in the rain close to shore, but the Japanese are not showing themselves in any way. We look towards the shore and have a conversation. Somewhere over the horizon is a British task force of cruisers and aircraft carriers. Rumour has it that one of the deck planes is due to fly naval representatives to Hong Kong to negotiate surrender with the Japanese delegation. The sky is covered with clouds. Not the most favourable conditions for flying. Someone says that the commander of the Japanese forces in Hong Kong has declared that he has no right to surrender to the British without the consent of his superior, who is in Canton. This means that the surrender of the Japanese is postponed for 4 days. Night is approaching. At dusk, Captain Shadwell transfers from the floating base to the submarine Selina, and she withdraws into the darkness. After a short time, the boat returns. It has come within 2 miles of Hong Kong, but the crew has not noticed anything significant. Once again, various rumours begin to spread. All night long, the submarines take turns circling our anchorage. We have overestimated the fighting qualities of the Japanese, but we must not underestimate their treachery. Dawning of the 30th of August. At dawn, the minesweepers set sail and slowly through the morning fog go north to the harbour entrance. They are followed by a floating base with its guns pointed towards the hills where the Japanese have a battery of 9-inch guns. Our boat moves slowly forward. Meanwhile, the sun is rising above the horizon and it is getting warmer. The masts of the task force ships appear in the distance. We recognize them. They are the aircraft carrier Indomitable, cruisers and Euryalus, as well as escorting them destroyers, led by Kempenfelt. To the south, the imposing silhouette of the battleship Anson begins to loom. A mile from the boom, we anchor. The minesweepers go on and turn round to clear the fairway for ships of the approaching fleet. In the sky, aeroplanes from the aircraft carrier are flying overhead. They will drop food for the prisoner of war camps. It's a beautiful day. Blue sea, clear sky, perfect visibility. The emerald hills of Hong Kong glisten in the distance. The white sails of junks sail past, indifferent to war and peace. A small bird from the shore perches on the rigging and peers at us. As the fleet lines up in the open sea, we notice a sampan heading towards the floating base from the shore, with a tall man standing at the stern and waving vigorously. A boat comes out to meet the boat, and after a while returns with a former prisoner of the internment. From him we learn what is going on in the colony. For a few days now, the Japanese have been behaving rather low-key and leaving Hong Kong whenever possible. The former civilian prisoners have been given freedom of movement, but there are still very many Japanese soldiers on the island. The Hong Kong police have resumed their duties. They are assisted by specially formed armed Chinese troops. The Japanese are acting purely in their own interests. They realize that it is much more profitable to deal with the British. If the island is taken over by the Chinese, a great deal of Japanese blood will be shed on these green hills. While we are talking to the ex-internee, a squadron of fighter planes swoops through the sky and the lead destroyer slowly enters the channel. Flags are flying on its topmasts. The operation has begun. Passing behind the destroyers, the cruisers fast, carrying Admiral Harcourt, Euryalus and Prince Robert enter the harbour. We raise anchor and enter the narrow fairway as well. The first impression is one of chaos and devastation. American bombs have turned many harbour structures into piles of concrete and mangled metal, but it wasn't just in the harbour that they fell. Half-destroyed houses can be seen in the hills. Still, war and destruction could do nothing to the beauty of these places. The emerald hills still glisten in the sunlight, and the white squares of the junk's sails continue to glide over the calm blue water. We pass the anchored cruisers to the mooring point. The landing parties from the other ships are already ashore. Our sailors, clumsy in their combat gear, are also ready to disembark and sweep the harbour area allotted to them. The red and white flag is still flying over the residence of the Japanese commander-in-chief. At the stone quay stands a Japanese destroyer. Its crew watches idly as we approach the pier. Despite the tense situation, no one is in a hurry. Everything is done as if in a slow pace, characteristic of a day off. The English ships are turning at anchor under the action of the tidal current. The Japanese watch with a weary resignation. If they want to make any provocation, it's not now. As we approach the pier, a sad picture is revealed. In a small bay, the rusty smokestack of a merchant ship sticks out of the water, and next to it are many tugs, diesel boats and small anti-submarine ships. They have not been repaired for a long time and look like dead ships waiting for their day of judgment. The pier is a pitiful sight, as well as the whole port. Broken cranes, huge pieces of steel and broken ships are lying around. It's hard to believe that the Japanese were going to stay in Hong Kong for long. We moor and lower the gangways. Marines in steel helmets search the harbour, looking into every nook and cranny. From the docks come rifle shots and the crackle of machine gun fire. Somewhere Japanese snipers are still active. There is a grenade explosion. The firing continues for another minute, and silence reigns. From the main deck you can see sailors running with automatic rifles in their hands. The scene is reminiscent of a Hollywood action film. The British naval flag flies above the harbour observation and communication post. Sailors moving along the shore, carefully stepping on the rocks. In a small building on the pier, they discover a room where Japanese sailors lived. The place is filthy and desolate. The sailors open drawers and doors with a long stick, but these precautions are unnecessary. The Japanese left their dwellings in a hurry and did not have time to set booby traps. They'd even thrown away their personal belongings, many of which were of English and American manufacture. One of the boxes contained the untouched belongings of a British naval petty officer, which had probably been there for 4 years. 600 Japanese officers, petty officers and privates were captured on the harbour area. They now sit sullenly in the hot sunshine, staring at the barrels of rifles in the strong hands of the Marines guarding them. Some of the captives look around with interest, but most have a sullen and pouty look. Surely the Emperor will have a few warm words for them when they return home. Hong Kong has never been a major naval base for the Japanese and, thanks to the effective American naval and land blockade, it has become a quiet backwater. For all that, the general condition of Japanese ships is dismal. Anti-submarine ships with a displacement of 200 tons of diesel drive and wooden hull. Armament on them is not bad, and judging by the condition of the guns, they were regularly cleaned and lubricated. But the living quarters leave a heavy impression. They are filthy and disorderly. Empty and not quite empty wine and beer bottles are lying everywhere. The walls of the rooms are poorly painted. At the slightest touch the paint falls off, revealing soot and rust. The tackle is no good either. Perhaps these abominable living conditions and lack of necessary materials were the reason for the Japanese defeat. Toward noon, the situation becomes clearer. All Japanese military personnel in the harbour have been captured. The harbour area is divided into sectors and assigned to ships, which are responsible for the cleanliness and normal functioning of their sector. Work begins immediately. Submarines carefully enter the harbour basin. Their crews are also tasked with tidying up some buildings and structures. Outside the harbour, the situation is not so clear. The Japanese flag is still flying over the Admiralty. In the harbour area we have about 300 armed sailors and marines. In the city, the Japanese have up to 4,000 soldiers. Our admiral must have prudently decided not to tempt fate and confine himself to one port for the time being. It's the pier to which we moored, in some places destroyed by shells, and jeeps from the floating base cannot pass into the port. We can't do without repairs. Our commander appeals to the chief of the guard and he allocates 30 Japanese prisoners for repair work. They begin the work reluctantly. But as the results of their efforts become visible, they begin to show interest in it. They pass bricks and stones up the chain and bring in wheelbarrows of sand. The fat, double-chinned petty officer alone does not show due diligence, but a light prick in the arse with a bayonet reminds him of his unconditional surrender and makes him move faster. These Japanese can be roughly divided into 3 groups. The first is the little bald, bespectacled men, who we refer to as the Hirohito type. They're not much use in the job. There are other, tougher and more hard-working Japanese. They're unpretentious and willing to do whatever they're told. We classify them as peasants. The third group of Japanese are very unpleasant types. I think they've always been like that. They're duplicitous, cunning, insolent and arrogant. You have to bayonet them often. Japanese officers form their own special caste. They're polite, smiling, but cunning and dangerous. The Japanese worked until sunset. Then they formed up and left, shuffling their heavy boots. Ragged, thin and hungry, they were a stark contrast to the tall, white-uniformed guard who accompanied them. It's night. Very quiet. The hills of Hong Kong appear black in the starlight. The onboard lights of the fleet's ships form fluttering golden lines over the water. Here and there, long beams of searchlights cut through the darkness. In and out of the harbour, diesel boats swim in and out of the harbour, stopping to inspect vessels that seem suspicious to them. From time to time, shots are heard from the city. It's snipers at work. The blue beam of a searchlight slides towards the hills, illuminating the terrain, houses and roads. A boat is being towed into the harbour with Japanese military men who have tried to escape to the mainland. This is how the night passes. Outside the harbour gates it is turbulent. Under the cover of night, the Chinese try to massacre the Japanese. They attack them and beat them to death. They punish those who cooperate with the enemy. One woman had her clothes torn off and had to seek protection from our phlegmatic sentries. It is fair to say that such manifestations of revenge are quite rare and the island is generally quiet. 31 August. Another clear morning. The water in the harbour is perfectly still. The sampans are huddled together at the quay. On them appeared flags, which the owners carefully kept during the occupation. Gradually, the harbour comes to life. Newly commissioned tugboats and water carriers depart from the pier. Chinese ferries run between the island and Kowloon. Hong Kong is in the throes of revival. We go ashore in search of labour, but it turns out that all the Japanese have been transferred to Wellington Barracks. A tired interpreter tracks down a Japanese officer and talks to him. The Japanese promises to provide us with a work crew if we can find a lorry and get to the barracks with him. Eventually we find an old Studebaker. The Japanese officer, together with our guards, climbs into the back and the lorry starts off. The engine, running on Japanese petrol, roars and sneezes. After the riots that broke out last night, the Japanese have cleared the streets adjacent to the port. It's very quiet now. Every 100 yards there are Japanese Marines with rifles at the ready. They pay no attention to our lorry. Wellington Barracks looks more decent than the rest of the neighbourhood. Sentries are on duty in front of the gate, and a few more men peer out of the guardhouse windows. They look at us with surprise. Our little passenger is glad to see his comrades and is very excited. He is evidently going to run to the gate, but we are not at all satisfied. As a matter of fact, he is not our prisoner, because the Japanese have not yet signed the Surrender Act. Besides, we are in enemy territory, and the Japanese greatly outnumber us. Nevertheless, we need this officer as a mediator, and we are not going to let him go. Our guards firmly block his way with their machine guns. The Japanese are shuffling from foot to foot and turning their heads like frightened children. Negotiations about the formation of a work brigade are not without shouting. The Japanese are crowded together and argue loudly about something. We put our weapons forward and glance defiantly at our watches, signalling that our patience is running out. In fact, we want to get back to the harbour area sooner, where we will feel much more confident. Time is running out. Just when we are really starting to lose patience, a group of Japanese sailors come forward and line up beside the lorry. They look pretty pathetic. The officer shouts orders them to line up and counts them. At our signal, they climb into the back of the truck, and now everything is ready for a triumphant return. But then the unexpected happens. The lorry won't start. Later we had to get used to the regular malfunctions, but at this moment the failure is absolutely unfortunate. We look at each other questioningly and do not know what to do. The situation is saved by the Hong Kong police, who provide us with another lorry. The Japanese get into it, and we drive off. The Chinese who met us on the way cast indifferent glances at the Japanese. In our presence, they do not dare to make offensive gestures. In the port, we divide the Japanese into two groups. The first group is sent to clean the harbour toilets, a very suitable occupation in this heat. The others are told to clean the pier where the floating base stands. This is an extremely important job, and I think our sailors will enjoy watching the Japanese do it. The poor condition of the Japanese sailors is striking. They work with difficulty, sweat a lot, and get tired quickly. At the same time, for some reason, the results of work do not correspond to the efforts spent. At noon, we take them back to the barracks. In the afternoon, we leave for the internment camp at Stanley. The winding road goes uphill. There's a father and son in the back of the jeep. They had travelled briefly to the city and were now returning to the camp where they had spent 3.5 years. The boy turns his head excitedly, spotting familiar buildings. The father tells us that when he drove down this road the last time, there were dead Englishmen and Canadians lying on it. Of the 64 men who hid in one house, only 6 were left alive. He is one of them. The man falls silent, turns his head and looks out over the harbour where the British fleet stands. We drive past the grim ruins of once beautiful houses, even their roofs stripped for firewood. This destruction shows that the Japanese really had no future in Hong Kong. Either they decided to completely devastate the island and destroy the British colony, or they realized that they would not last long here. As the bright camped buildings rise up ahead, our passengers begin to smile. Now this prison is doorless. The jeep drives through the gate and a Chinese guard with a Japanese rifle in his hands salutes us with a cheerful smile. Stanley is in a very picturesque location. If you forget about the purpose of these buildings, you get the impression that you are on a holiday base, which is enhanced by the brightly dressed girls. Probably before the war, picnics were often organized here. There are no facilities in the small rooms, but most of the internees managed to adapt. Of course, the food situation is much improved now. To get a true picture of life in the camp before the Japanese left, we went around the camp and talked to the inhabitants. They told us that there was a catastrophic shortage of food. The main foodstuffs were rice and spinach, which were cooked in the public canteen and distributed to the prisoners. But these foods were not enough, especially for the men, and the lack of vitamins affected their health. Sometimes food parcels came from the Red Cross, but most of the food was put aside or given to the camp doctors. Under certain conditions, it was possible to get food from the guards. A few Chinese and whites among the internees created a veritable black market for food. Watches, wedding rings and gold crowns were exchanged for small amounts of food. Guards from the locals took an active part in this business. They were not supporters of the Japanese. They, former fishermen and farmers, were drafted into the service, torn away from home and family. The pay was ridiculously low, and not surprisingly, they took advantage of their position to make capital. By the time we arrived, many of the men had gone to the city to assist the military authorities. Some had joined the new civil administration. So the rooms we entered were not crowded as they had been before. One room, 7 by 12 feet, was divided in half by a screen of sheets. A married couple lived in one half, a single man in the other. What the Japanese did in the early days of the occupation was nothing short of brutal. After hearing stories from former prisoners about their cruelties, we became a little bit hardened ourselves. From the southern rooms you can see the prison yard, where torture and executions often took place. In the first weeks, the bodies of dead British and Canadian soldiers lay on the rocks below the camp. They were not allowed to be buried, and the corpses turned into white skeletons before the eyes of the prisoners. We were shown the graves of 3 nurses who had died in the hospital after being raped and bayoneted. You could still see traces of blood on the stone steps. Looking at them, we were reminded of the sick and wounded Japanese who had been brought from the Chinese front and housed in Kowloon hospitals, where they would be cared for by doctors, until Japanese ships came to collect them. Despite all we had seen and heard, visiting the camp lifted our spirits. The liberation of the British, Dutch, Norwegians, and Chinese languishing, there was a beautiful final chord of our participation in the war. We ride back up the sun-drenched hillsides past Chinese families on carts, carrying their rudimentary belongings back to the city. The peasants smile cheerfully at us from under their wide hats. Young Chinese women stride lightly along the road, swaying their black trouser-clad. In a house near the little cove, Japanese officers still live. The armed sentries standing by the side of the road do not stop us. Some even salute carelessly. The water in the bay beckons. We stop the car ourselves and walk to the beach. A Japanese officer comes out of a house and shouts something to us. We turn round and answer him with unprintable expressions. His Chinese girlfriend, standing on the doorstep, looks at us with wide-open eyes. We leave our clothes on an overturned old boat, enter the cool water, and slowly float. No towels are needed because the sun is blazing and a light breeze is blowing. After swimming, we pass the fishing village of Aberdeen. Numerous junks are crowded in the narrow bay with their bows to the stone jetty. Nearby, fish is drying on the shore. Despite the foul odour, the place is not without charm. Above every house and every junk there is a Chinese flag. Whatever our politicians may say, the Chinese strive for unity, and if they cannot achieve it, it is through no fault of their own. The city is calm. Passers-by greet our arrival with cheers and hand claps. They smile broadly, and I think they are laughing at our little jeep. The Japanese push huge carts of personal belongings along the road. The Chinese watch them with indifference, but you can see it's costing them a lot of effort. The crowd resembles a huge volcano, ready to spew out fiery lava at any moment, and it did explode after the Japanese surrendered their weapons to the British warehouses. The Japanese began to leave the island on 2 September. The last days were the most harrowing for them. Their scattered groups, trying to organize themselves in any way, appeared in different parts of Hong Kong, many representatives of the land of the rising sun, trying to escape the wrath of the Chinese soldiers of the irregular army, went down the river in junks. We sent these poor souls to Kowloon, where they were placed in a prisoner of war camp. On the last day, about 3,000 men were sent to the mainland by the ships. On the 2nd of September at 11 o'clock, the Japanese flag hanging over the stone roof of the Navy Commander's residence building came down. This came as a surprise, for the fleet commander thought it prudent not to touch the flag until 4 p.m., when the evacuation would be completed, and had made his subordinates aware of it. By 11:30 o'clock, a shore detachment of 3 units, under the command of the combat arms commander of the Maidstone floating base, had stealthily surrounded the commander-in-chief's residence, where the Japanese naval headquarters was located. From their hiding places, the sailors watched his last convulsions and glanced at their watches. There was a long wait ahead. They were very surprised when a jeep, in which sat an officer of the submarine's reserve crew with 2 armed sailors, drove past them and stopped just in front of the main entrance to the building. Paying no attention to the indignant sentries, the officer and the sailors went inside and a few minutes later appeared on the flat roof of the building. They approached the flagpole and quickly removed the Japanese flag from it, and then the commander's flag, which was hanging on the other side of the roof. The British and Japanese watching looked at each other in amazement, and when they looked up, the British naval flag was already flying over the commander's residence. This momentous occasion passed without incident, and the Japanese flags were victoriously delivered to the floating base Maidstone. So the Japanese were leaving Hong Kong, and as the last of them boarded the ship, the city woke up. From the streets and quays, from balconies and windows, came the crackle of Chinese fireworks. The rockets whistled and crackled as if a decisive battle were being fought. The evil spirits were very uncomfortable in the city this night. The generator station, which was switched on, started throwing out sparks and puffs of smoke. Fires lit up on the hills, their light merged with the light of the stars and reflected in the waters of the harbour where our fleet stood.
We drive the jeep towards Kowloon, and the road begins to climb uphill. The higher it goes, the colder the air gets. An airstrip spreads out below, with a few silver fighter jets standing on it. We pull into a pass where the skinny ground has a reddish hue, and the chauffeur stops the car because there is a very beautiful view from here. We look down on a huge bay, from which narrow bays branch off and disappear behind the rock. Far down in the valley, we can see the silver ribbon of the river. At the place where the river flows into the sea, there is a small village.
We turn off the smooth asphalt road and drive along another, unpaved one, resembling a dried-up riverbed. The jeep bounces on bumps, brakes squeal, but we are determined to get to that village. The farmsteads, reminiscent of Scottish farms from afar, are almost unscathed by the war. The rice fields are remarkably green. The only thing missing is tourists with cameras. We drive over a narrow stone bridge and stop at a fork near the village. We get out of the car and expose our faces to the hot sun. A group of men and women appear around the corner. When they see us, they stop for a moment, as if they can't believe their eyes, and then they rush towards us with shouts and smiles on their faces. We did not expect such a welcome. The Chinese shake our hands with genuine joy. One of them can explain himself in English. He says it's the first time he's seen white people in 4 years. He asks if all the Japanese have left the island. We give them cigarettes. The girls take them with a confused look and light up. The smoke wafts in the air. A man who speaks English speaks to us as equals. He thanks us for helping the Chinese drive out the Japanese, praises Chiang Kai-shek, and says in a confident voice that the 4 great powers must now stick together. In response to our question about the Chinese communists, he shakes his head. China is a country of peasants and workers whose true essence cannot be expressed in the terminology adopted in the West. As he talks, he wrinkles his nose and gesticulates vigorously. In his opinion, the European notion of progress is of no value to the simple Chinese peasant who can hardly read or write. We reluctantly leave this hospitable little valley. Our 2 new friends settle into the back seat with a satisfied look. They get out in Kowloon, and as we pull away, they wave after us and shout in English. See you later. Admiral Fraser arrived from Japan on the liner Duke of York. The surrender ceremony was delayed from day to day, but by 16 September all formalities had been settled, and Admiral Harcourt officially announced that the Japanese were leaving the colony. As soon as the Surrender Act was signed, the warships fired a salute of gun salvos. Hong Kong returned to normal life. At 9 p.m. on 16 September, the Navy set off festive fireworks and illuminations in the harbour. In the sky above the water moved and crossed the blue beams of searchlights. Red and green rockets flashed with a crackle. The residents were not left in debt, and the darkness over the city was illuminated with multicoloured lights. Everyone was happy that night. The salute of victory thundered down. The sailors returned home to a peaceful life. The stars still shone and the moon rose. The waves of the sea, as before, with a murmur roll up on the shores. The sea, an environment so familiar to the people of Britain, is no longer a place of battle. Ships sail with lights blazing to the farthest ends of the globe, and will continue to do so, no matter what. If need be, British men will return to the sea, for they are sailors by nature, and the sea is their second home. Thinking back to the seas he has sailed, to the sunny southern ports and the cold waters of the north, an English sailor can safely repeat the words spoken by a courtier in Shakespeare's immortal comedy. Some day, in a world more perfect than this, I shall love you all the more.